The courtroom was silent. Not the usual kind of quiet, but the thick, heavy silence that comes when something is very, very wrong. Two police officers sat at the defendant's table, their uniforms still crisp, their hands fidgeting on the wooden surface. They had been here before, many times, in fact, but never on this side of the room. They had arrested people, dozens, maybe hundreds, but they had never been arrested themselves, and they certainly had never imagined this. Then, the door at the back of the courtroom opened, and everyone stood. The judge was coming in. All rise for the honorable judge. The bailiff started to announce, but he barely got the words out before the officers' faces twisted in shock. The judge stepping onto the bench was the very same black woman they had thrown in the back of their squad car just days ago. One of the officers, Officer Reynolds, swallowed hard. The other, Officer Tate, looked like he had seen a ghost. Judge Lisa Montgomery met their eyes with the calm, controlled expression she had perfected over the years. But deep down, she could feel the weight of the moment pressing on her chest. She sat down, looked over the courtroom. Then, in a steady voice, she spoke. "Let's begin." The officers exchanged nervous glances. They had made a terrible mistake. The day had started like any other for Lisa Montgomery. She had woken up before the sun, as she always did, and brewed a cup of coffee. The city outside her window was just starting to wake up. Cars honking, birds chirping, the distant sound of laughter from people on their morning jogs. Lisa sipped her coffee and took a deep breath. She had a full day ahead of her. Court cases to preside over. Decisions to make. But before all of that, she wanted to do something simple. Something human. She grabbed her coat and headed out for a walk. She had always loved walking through her neighborhood. It was a mix of old and new, brick buildings that had stood for decades alongside shiny glass towers that seemed to touch the clouds. The bakery on the corner smelled like cinnamon and fresh bread, and she smiled as she passed it. She wasn't a judge on these streets. Here, she was just Lisa. She nodded at the man who ran the newspaper stand, an older gentleman named Mr. Johnson. He had been there since she was a kid. "Morning, Judge," he said with a warm grin. She chuckled. "Morning, Mr. Johnson." She continued walking, enjoying the crisp morning air. But just as she turned onto a quieter street, she heard shouting. "Hey, stop right there." She turned her head and saw two white police officers rushing toward her. Confused, she looked behind her, thinking they must be chasing someone else. But there was no one there. Just her. A second later, one of them grabbed her arm. "Hey," Lisa snapped, jerking back. "What is this about?" The officer tightened his grip. "Put your hands where I can see them." The taller one, Officer Tate, demanded. Lisa's heart pounded. "Excuse me. We got a call about a suspicious person in the area," Officer Reynolds added. "A suspicious person?" Lisa repeated, her voice sharp. "I was just walking. Do you live around here?" Lisa inhaled sharply, trying to keep her composure. She had handled many cases where situations like this had gone horribly wrong. But now, it was happening to her. "Yes," she said, her voice controlled. "I live a few blocks away." Tate scoffed. "We need to see some ID." Lisa reached into her coat pocket slowly. She knew better than to make sudden movements. But before she could even pull out her wallet, Reynolds grabbed her other arm. "That's enough," he said. "Turn around." Lisa froze. This was not happening. "I don't understand," she said, her voice measured but firm. "What exactly do you think I did?" "You're resisting," Tate snapped. That word, resisting, it sent a chill down her spine. "I'm not." But it didn't matter. The next thing she knew, cold metal cuffs were snapping around her wrists. A woman gasped from across the street. A man holding a bag of groceries stopped in his tracks. "Hey, what are you doing?" someone called out. But Lisa wasn't in control anymore. They pushed her toward their squad car, ignoring her protests. As they shoved her inside, she made a decision. She could tell them who she was. She could say she was a judge, that they were making a mistake. But something in her gut told her not to. Not yet. She sat quietly in the back of the car as they drove off, her hands still bound. Her heart was racing, but her mind was sharper than ever. They had no idea, and they were about to learn the biggest lesson of their lives. Lisa was taken to the station, where the officers barely looked at her as they processed her. They fingerprinted her, took her mugshot, and placed her in a holding cell. For hours, she sat on the hard bench, staring at the gray walls. She listened to the sounds of other people coming and going. People who had been arrested, officers laughing in the hallway, the distant ringing of phones. No one asked her any real questions. No one cared about her side of the story. And that was the problem. Lisa Montgomery had spent years studying the law, defending it, upholding it. She had spent her career making sure people were treated fairly in the courtroom. And yet, here she was, just another black woman, assumed guilty without question. She closed her eyes, took a slow breath. She would not let this break her. Hours later, another officer, an older black man with tired eyes, finally approached her cell. "Judge Montgomery," he said, his voice low. Lisa nodded. The man let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "Lord have mercy." 2 days later, Lisa was standing in the courtroom again. Only this time, she wasn't behind bars. She wasn't in cuffs. She was exactly where she belonged, on the bench, in her robe, holding the gavel in her hand. And now, the same 2 officers who had arrested her sat in front of her, their faces pale, their hands gripping the table like they were about to fall off a cliff. Lisa let the silence stretch for a long, long moment. Then she spoke. "Do you know who I am now?" Tate swallowed hard. Reynolds glanced down at his lap. Lisa leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "This," she said, her voice steady, "is what happens when you judge someone before you know their story." And just like that, the gavel came down. Boom. The whole courtroom jumped. And the case was just beginning. The courtroom was thick with tension. Lisa Montgomery could feel it pressing against her skin, humming in the silence that followed the sharp boom of her gavel. Officer Reynolds and Officer Tate sat stiffly at the defendant's table, their faces unreadable, but she could see the way their shoulders tensed, the way their hands twitched. They were afraid. Good. Not because she wanted them to suffer. Lisa wasn't that kind of person. But because fear meant realization. It meant they were starting to understand what they had done. Lisa took a slow breath, keeping her voice level. She was in control now. "I will be presiding over this case," she said, her tone steady, unshakable. "And I will ensure that justice is served." Reynolds opened his mouth as if to say something, then shut it again. He looked pale, sweat forming at his temples. Tate, on the other hand, seemed to be gripping his own anger like a lifeline, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might crack. Lisa tapped a pen against the bench, letting the silence stretch. She wanted them to feel every second of it. Then, with a voice as sharp as a blade, she asked, "Do you recall the events of 3 days ago?" Reynolds flinched. Tate's lips pressed into a thin line. Lisa wasn't going to let them escape this. Not yet. 3 days earlier, after being thrown into a jail cell, Lisa had remained calm. She sat quietly, counting each breath, reminding herself that she was not powerless. But the truth was, it didn't matter who she was in that moment. She was just another black woman in handcuffs. No badge, no robe, no courtroom, just assumptions. She knew how these situations could end. She had seen too many cases, read too many reports. It didn't matter how successful you were, how educated you were. All that mattered was what they chose to see. Lisa had been given a single phone call. She had dialed one number. Her best friend, Claire Harris. Claire was an attorney. Fierce. Relentless. The kind of woman who could stare down a lion and make it second-guess its choices. She answered on the second ring. "Lisa? What's wrong?" Lisa exhaled slowly. "I need you to get me out of here." Claire didn't hesitate. "Where are you?" Lisa gave her the details, her voice controlled. Claire was silent for a moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice was low and dangerous. "I'm on my way." Lisa hung up and leaned back against the cold wall of the holding cell. She wouldn't sit here forever. But she also knew something deeper now, something that burned in her chest like fire. She couldn't just let this go. Lisa's release came hours later, but the memory of the way the officers had treated her sat like a stone in her gut. They never asked for her name, never gave her a chance to explain. And now, here they were, standing in her courtroom. Lisa took a deep breath, shifting her focus back to the present. "Officers Reynolds and Tate," she said, folding her hands on the bench. "Do you deny that you unlawfully detained and arrested me without probable cause?" Tate's face darkened, and for the first time, he spoke. His voice was stiff, defensive. "We were responding to a report of a suspicious person." Lisa's eyebrow arched. "And what made me suspicious, Officer Tate?" Tate hesitated. Lisa waited. He exhaled sharply. "We had a description." Lisa tilted her head. "Describe it." Tate clenched his jaw, glancing at Reynolds. who looked like he wished he could disappear into the floor. After a long pause, Tate muttered, "A black woman, dark coat, walking alone." Lisa let his words hang in the air, thick with weight. Then she leaned forward, her voice cool. "So you saw a black woman walking, and that was enough?" Neither officer answered. Lisa let out a slow breath. "You arrested me without evidence. You violated my rights. And if I had been anyone else, anyone without power, without connections, I might still be in that cell." Silence. Reynolds wouldn't meet her gaze. Tate swallowed hard, the truth sinking into his bones. Lisa's fingers drummed against the bench. Then, she spoke the words that would decide their fate. "I hope you understand that this is not just a case about me," she said. "It's about every person you've ever done this to. Every man, woman, and child who never got a fair chance because you didn't think they deserved one." Reynolds finally looked up, guilt carved into his features. Tate just sat there, breathing hard, as if the weight of his actions had finally settled on his shoulders. Lisa exhaled. "This court will hear the full details of your conduct, and justice will be served accordingly." The officers' faces drained of color. Lisa tapped her gavel once, sharp and final. Boom. "This hearing is adjourned." The courtroom erupted into hushed murmurs. But Lisa didn't hear them. She was already thinking about what came next. This wasn't just about her. This was about change. And she wasn't going to stop until it happened. Lisa Montgomery stepped down from the bench, her pulse steady, her expression unreadable. The courtroom still buzzed with murmurs, and the two officers sat frozen, their bodies stiff, their eyes darting around as if they were trapped. She walked past them without another glance. She had made her statement. Now, it was time to let justice take its course. Outside the courtroom, Claire Harris was waiting. The moment Lisa stepped through the heavy wooden doors, Claire's arms were crossed, her sharp eyes locked onto her. Lisa sighed, shaking her head. "Before you say anything." "Oh, I'm saying something," Claire interrupted, marching toward her. "Do you know how much restraint it took for me not to barge in there and personally drag those officers out by their collars?" Lisa gave her a tired smile. "That's exactly why I didn't tell you beforehand." Claire huffed, flipping one of her tight curls over her shoulder. "Lisa, this is huge. Those officers," she lowered her voice, glancing around. "They're about to get the biggest reality check of their lives." Lisa nodded, exhaling slowly. "Good." Claire studied her for a long moment. "Are you okay?" Lisa hesitated. She was okay, but she wasn't fine. Fine meant this hadn't shaken her. Fine meant she wasn't thinking about the cold bite of the handcuffs, the roughness of their hands on her arms, the feeling of helplessness. She had never been helpless before. Not like that. But in that cell, she had been just another black woman behind bars. Lisa inhaled sharply and nodded. "I will be." Claire frowned but didn't push. Instead, she reached into her bag, pulled out a folder, and handed it to Lisa. "Here. Everything we have so far." Lisa flipped it open. Inside were case files, complaints against officers Reynolds and Tate. Her stomach twisted. She had suspected it, but seeing it on paper made it real. There were more victims. More people who had been thrown in handcuffs without reason, humiliated, and pushed aside. And most of them didn't get to sit in the judge's chair after it was all over. Lisa clenched her jaw. This wasn't just about her. It never had been. Reynolds sat at the bar, his fingers tight around his drink. The dim lights cast shadows across his face, but even in the low glow, Tate could see the sweat on his brow. Tate took a sip of his own drink, his grip firm around the glass. "You gonna say something, or are you just gonna sit there looking like you've seen a ghost?" Reynolds didn't answer immediately. He just exhaled slowly, staring at nothing. Then, finally, he muttered, "We arrested a judge." Tate scoffed, shaking his head. "Yeah, we sure as hell did." Reynolds let out a bitter laugh, rubbing a hand down his face. "And now she's the one deciding our fate." Tate's jaw tightened. He had spent years in law enforcement, priding himself on doing his job right. But today had rattled him in a way he didn't want to admit. "She's gonna bury us," Reynolds muttered. "We're done." Tate slammed his drink down, the sound sharp. "No, we're not." Reynolds frowned. "Tate, we made a mistake," Tate said, his voice low, his hands tightening into fists. "But we're not criminals." Reynolds let out a dry laugh. "Tell that to the people we arrested who didn't deserve it." Tate looked away. Because the truth was, deep down, he knew Reynolds was right. And that truth was a lot harder to swallow than he had expected. Lisa sat in her office, the case files spread out in front of her. It was late, too late, but she couldn't sleep. Not yet. Each file told a different story, but they all shared the same ending. Unlawful arrests. Unnecessary force. People who had been stopped for no reason other than looking suspicious. She ran her fingers over the pages, her heart heavy. This wasn't just about two officers. This was about a system that let them operate this way. She could punish them, and she would, but that wasn't enough. Lisa Montgomery had spent her entire career fighting for justice. But tonight, she felt something deeper than that. She felt a fire. Something had to change, and she was going to make sure it did. Boom, boom, boom. A knock at her door pulled her out of her thoughts. Lisa sat up, frowning. Come in. The door opened, and a young clerk peeked inside, looking hesitant. Judge Montgomery? There's someone here to see you. Lisa frowned. Who? The clerk shifted nervously. Officer Reynolds. Lisa went still. Then, she slowly closed the file in front of her. Send him in. Reynolds stepped inside, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked smaller than he had in the courtroom, his confidence stripped away, his uniform gone. Lisa gestured to the chair across from her desk. Sit. He hesitated, then obeyed. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Lisa leaned forward, folding her hands. Why are you here? Reynolds licked his lips, his foot tapping anxiously. I just wanted to say something. Lisa arched an eyebrow. Go on. He swallowed hard, glancing down at the desk before meeting her eyes. I was wrong. Lisa tilted her head, waiting. Reynolds exhaled, his hands gripping the edges of the chair. That day, when we stopped you, I didn't think. He shook his head, his voice raw. I made assumptions, and I've made them before. Lisa stayed silent. Reynolds ran a hand over his face. I told myself I was just doing my job, that we were keeping the streets safe. But I see it now. His voice dropped. I see what we did. Lisa studied him, searching his face. And what is that, Officer Reynolds? He inhaled sharply. We treated you like a criminal before we even knew who you were, he admitted, his voice tight. And not just you. Others, too. Lisa felt a flicker of something. Maybe relief, maybe exhaustion. Maybe both. She took a slow breath. And what are you going to do about it? Reynolds hesitated. I don't know, he admitted. But I know I need to do something. Lisa tapped her fingers against the desk. I hope so, she said quietly. Because words meant nothing without action. She studied him for a moment longer, then stood up. This conversation is over, she said, her voice firm. I suggest you think very carefully about your next steps, Officer Reynolds. Reynolds nodded, standing as well. He hesitated, then murmured, I'm sorry. Lisa didn't respond, because sorry wasn't enough. As he walked out, she let out a slow breath. One down, one more to go. And something told her that Tate wouldn't be so easy. And that was going to be a problem. Lisa Montgomery stared at the closed door long after Officer Reynolds left. His words echoed in her mind. I was wrong. I need to do something. She wanted to believe him. She really did. But she also knew that regret was easy. Change was hard. And there was still one more officer who hadn't come forward. Tate. Lisa exhaled slowly, rubbing her temples. Officer Reynolds had shown a glimmer of self-awareness, a crack in his armor. But Tate? He had sat in that courtroom stone-faced, rigid, refusing to acknowledge the reality of what had happened. That man had no intention of apologizing, and that meant he was dangerous. Lisa knew officers like him, men who refused to believe they could be wrong. And those men were the ones who did the most harm. Lisa squared her shoulders. She had fought for justice her entire life. She wasn't going to stop now. Tate would have his day in court, and she would make sure he faced the truth, whether he was ready or not. Tate wasn't the type to drown his problems in alcohol. But tonight, he was on his second whiskey, and it still wasn't enough. The bar was half empty, the low hum of conversation in the background, the smell of cheap liquor hanging in the air. Across from him, Reynolds swirled his drink in his glass. I went to see her, he muttered. Tate's jaw clenched. He didn't need to ask who Reynolds was talking about. Lisa Montgomery. Tate exhaled sharply. Why? Reynolds let out a bitter laugh. Because I needed to own up to it. Tate scoffed. Own up to what? Reynolds snapped his head up, eyes flashing. To what we did, Tate. Tate clenched his jaw. We were doing our job. Reynolds slammed his glass down. Were we? His voice was sharp now. Because I'm starting to think we weren't. Tate glared at him. You're letting her get inside your head. Reynolds shook his head. No, Tate. She didn't have to get inside my head. The truth was already there. He leaned forward, his voice low, dangerous. You don't see it, do you? How many people have we done this to? How many people have we thrown in the back of our car just because they looked suspicious? How many times have we made a mistake and never thought twice about it? Tate didn't answer. Reynolds exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening around his glass. That woman sat in a cell, Tate. A judge, and we didn't even bother to ask her who she was. Tate gritted his teeth. So what? She had connections. She got out. Reynolds' eyes flashed with something dark. And what if she didn't? Silence. For the first time, Tate didn't have an answer. Lisa arrived at the courthouse early the next morning, determined. She had barely stepped inside when Claire was on her heels. I heard Reynolds came to see you last night. Lisa gave a small nod. He did. Claire studied her. Do you think he meant it? Lisa sighed. I think he regrets it. But regret doesn't change what happened. Claire nodded. And Tate? Lisa's lips pressed into a thin line. Nothing from him. Claire exhaled, shaking her head. I didn't expect there would be. Lisa adjusted the files in her arms. We'll see what happens in court. Claire crossed her arms. You think he'll fight it? Lisa looked at her friend, her expression firm. I think he still believes he did nothing wrong. Claire muttered a curse under her breath. And that makes him dangerous. Lisa nodded. Yes, it does. Officer Tate sat stiffly at the defendant's table, his jaw locked, his expression unreadable. Reynolds sat beside him, but he looked different today, his posture tense, his eyes cast downward. Lisa studied them both before shifting her gaze to the courtroom. It was full. Word had spread. Judges, attorneys, community leaders, they were all here to see what would happen next. Lisa tapped her gavel. This court is now in session. The room fell silent. She turned her gaze to the prosecution. Proceed. The attorney stood, adjusting his tie. Your Honor, we intend to present evidence of systematic misconduct, not just against you, but against multiple individuals who were subjected to unlawful stops and arrests by these officers. A ripple of murmurs ran through the courtroom. Tate's shoulders stiffened. Lisa kept her face unreadable. Proceed. The attorney nodded, flipping open his folder. Let's start with the first documented complaint. He turned, locking eyes with Tate. Officer Tate, do you recall a Marcus Ellison? Tate's jaw twitched. No. The attorney lifted a file. That's strange. Because according to this report, you arrested him last year for loitering. Except there was no loitering charge ever filed. Tate's hands clenched into fists. The attorney flipped the page. Let's move on to Jasmine Carter. Arrested for suspicious behavior, when all she was doing was waiting for a bus. Lisa watched as Tate's face darkened. The attorney placed the file down. This isn't about one mistake, Officer Tate. It's about a pattern. Tate finally spoke. His voice was rough, defensive. We were following protocol. The attorney's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. And what exactly is that protocol, officer? Silence. Lisa leaned forward, her voice cool. Answer the question, Officer Tate. Tate's jaw clenched. We stop suspicious individuals. Lisa raised an eyebrow. Define suspicious. Tate swallowed. Lisa tapped her pen against the bench. Is suspicious a person walking in their own neighborhood? Tate's throat bobbed. Lisa's voice was sharp now. Is suspicious just being black? A heavy silence filled the room. Tate opened his mouth, then shut it. Lisa leaned back in her chair. That's what I thought. Tate's hands were trembling. Because in this moment, he realized something terrifying. He wasn't just losing control. He had never really had it in the first place. Lisa let the silence stretch before speaking again. This court will hear every single complaint against you, she said. And we will decide if you deserve to wear that badge. Tate's breath hitched. Because for the first time in his career, he was the one on trial. And Lisa Montgomery wasn't going to let him walk away so easily. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Every person in the room had their eyes locked onto Officer Tate, waiting for his response. But he just sat there, jaw tight, shoulders squared, like a man who had been backed into a corner. Lisa Montgomery could see it. The flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, the way his fingers curled into fists against the table. He was cracking. Good. Lisa tapped her pen against the bench, waiting. I asked you a question, Officer Tate. Tate swallowed hard. He exhaled sharply. I don't target people because of race. Lisa arched an eyebrow. Then explain why nearly all of your unlawful arrests involved black individuals. A ripple of murmurs ran through the courtroom. Tate's fingers twitched against the table. Lisa continued, her voice cool and sharp. Because when I look at these reports, I see a pattern. A dangerous one. A pattern that suggests you've been operating under the belief that certain people are more suspicious than others. Tate clenched his jaw. I did my job. Lisa nodded slowly. Did you? The attorney for the prosecution leaned forward. Officer Tate, do you believe that unconscious bias exists? Tate hesitated. It's a yes or no question, officer. Tate shifted in his seat. I suppose. Lisa's eyes narrowed. Then let me rephrase. Do you believe that you may have unconscious bias? Tate bristled. His face darkened, his lips pressing into a thin line. But he didn't answer. And that was answer enough. Lisa let the silence stretch. She had spent years in the legal system. She knew that sometimes the best way to reveal a person's truth was to let them sit in it. She turned to the prosecution. Proceed. The attorney stood. Your Honor, we'd like to call our first witness. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. A young man stepped inside, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. Lisa immediately recognized his name from the case files. Marcus Ellison, the man Tate had arrested for loitering. Tate's fingers twitched as Marcus walked past him. Marcus took his seat at the witness stand. The attorney approached. Mr. Ellison, can you describe the events of your arrest last year? Marcus exhaled slowly, gripping the edges of the stand. His voice was calm, but Lisa could hear the frustration woven into it. I was waiting for my brother outside his apartment building, he said. He had forgotten his wallet, and I told him I'd meet him downstairs to give it to him. The attorney nodded. And what happened next? Marcus glanced at Tate, his eyes sharp. 2 officers approached me. They asked what I was doing there. The attorney folded his hands. And did you explain? Marcus nodded. Yes, but they didn't care. They said I looked suspicious and asked for my ID. His voice tightened. I told them I lived there, that my brother could vouch for me. Lisa watched as his jaw clenched. But before I could even get my phone out to call him, Marcus continued. I was in handcuffs. A few people in the courtroom gasped. Lisa remained silent, watching Tate. His shoulders were rigid, his jaw set. The attorney nodded. And did they give you a reason for your arrest? Marcus let out a bitter chuckle. They said I was loitering. In front of the building I lived in. Lisa tapped her fingers on the bench, eyes locked on Tate. Officer Tate, she said evenly. Do you recall this incident? Tate inhaled sharply. He hesitated. I remember an arrest, yes. Lisa's expression didn't waver. And looking back, do you believe it was justified? Tate's jaw twitched. At the time, I thought. Lisa cut him off. I didn't ask what you thought then. I'm asking you now. Silence. The courtroom was holding its breath. Tate's fingers curled into fists on the table. His face was tight, his eyes dark. Finally, after a long pause, he exhaled sharply and muttered, No. Lisa nodded slowly. No, it wasn't justified. The words settled over the room like a heavy weight. Lisa turned to Marcus. Mr. Ellison, is there anything you would like to say to Officer Tate? Marcus stared at Tate, his voice steady. Yeah. I want to know if he would have arrested me if I was a white guy in a suit. The question sliced through the courtroom like a blade. Tate flinched, but he didn't answer. And in that silence, everyone knew the truth. Later that evening, Lisa sat in her office, rubbing her temples. She had seen many men like Tate in her years as a judge. Men who refused to see the truth until it was staring them in the face. The problem was, most of them still didn't change. A knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. She straightened. Come in. The door creaked open. And standing there, looking hesitant, looking nothing like the officer who had thrown her in a squad car days ago, was Tate. Lisa studied him, unreadable. Tate stepped forward, his throat bobbing. I don't expect you to believe me, he said, his voice rough. But I see it now. Lisa arched an eyebrow. See what? Tate exhaled. That I've been wrong. A long time. Lisa let the silence stretch between them. Then, she folded her hands on the desk. And what are you going to do about it? Tate swallowed hard. I don't know. Lisa's gaze didn't waver. Then figure it out. Tate nodded, stiffly, like a man carrying a weight he had never felt before. He turned toward the door. But just before he walked out, Lisa called after him. Officer Tate. He stopped, glancing back. Lisa met his gaze. Regret means nothing if it doesn't lead to action. Tate inhaled sharply. Then, with a small nod, he walked out. Lisa leaned back in her chair. Tate had finally seen the truth. But seeing was one thing. Doing something about it was another. And she would be watching. Because this wasn't over yet. Lisa Montgomery sat in her office, staring at the case files still spread across her desk. The trial wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. Tate had cracked, but a crack wasn't the same as a break. People like him, people who had spent years in their own bubble, often thought that one moment of realization was enough to make everything right. But Lisa knew better. One apology didn't erase the damage. One conversation didn't fix the system. Lisa wasn't just after words. She wanted action. And tomorrow, the trial would continue. Tate sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. The courthouse loomed in front of him, its towering pillars casting long shadows in the dim streetlights. He should have driven home by now. But instead, he sat there, staring at his own reflection in the windshield. Lisa's words echoed in his mind. Regret means nothing if it doesn't lead to action. He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. Because for the first time in his career, he wasn't just thinking about himself. He was thinking about them. Marcus Ellison, Jasmine Carter, the judge, the woman he had thrown in handcuffs without a second thought. How many people had he done this to? How many had he dismissed, just like that? He felt sick. Because deep down, he had always known. He had just never wanted to see it. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. Word had spread fast. Reporters lined the back, their cameras ready. Community leaders sat in the audience, their faces set with expectation. Lisa took her seat on the bench, adjusting her robe. She could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on her. This wasn't just another case. This was a reckoning. Tate and Reynolds sat at the defendant's table. Reynolds looked tired, like a man who had spent the night carrying guilt on his shoulders. Tate, on the other hand, was staring straight ahead, his jaw tight. Lisa tapped her gavel once. This court is now in session. The prosecution stood. Your Honor, today, we will be presenting testimony from additional witnesses who have experienced similar treatment at the hands of the defendants. Lisa nodded. Proceed. The doors opened, and a young woman stepped in. Lisa recognized her name from the files. Jasmine Carter. She walked to the stand, her chin high, but Lisa could see the tension in her shoulders. The attorney approached. Miss Carter, can you recount the day of your arrest? Jasmine inhaled sharply. I was at a bus stop. Just waiting. I had just gotten off work. The attorney nodded. And what happened? Jasmine's hands tightened in her lap. A squad car pulled up. 2 officers got out. They asked me what I was doing there. Lisa glanced at Tate. He was looking down. Jasmine continued. I told them I was waiting for the bus. One of them asked for my ID. I asked why. He said I looked suspicious. The attorney folded his hands. And did they find anything illegal? Any reason to arrest you? Jasmine scoffed. No, but they still put me in cuffs and took me to the station. I sat there for 4 hours before they let me go. The courtroom murmured. Lisa turned her gaze back to Tate. Officer Tate, do you remember this arrest? Tate exhaled sharply. Yes. Lisa tilted her head. And do you still believe it was justified? Tate hesitated. Then, after a long moment, he muttered, no. Lisa studied him. Why? Tate swallowed. Because I never should have stopped her in the first place. Lisa let the weight of those words settle over the room. Then she turned back to Jasmine. Miss Carter, is there anything you'd like to say to Officer Tate? Jasmine's eyes burned with something fierce. I want to know what he sees when he looks at me now. Tate looked up, startled. Jasmine's voice didn't waver. Because when he looked at me that day, all he saw was a criminal. And I want to know if that's still what he sees. The room was dead silent. Tate swallowed hard. His voice was rough, almost broken. No, he said quietly. I see a person. A woman who should never have been in handcuffs. Jasmine held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded, her face unreadable. Lisa exhaled. Thank you, Miss Carter. You may step down. Jasmine walked back to her seat, her head high. Lisa turned back to the prosecution. Continue. The attorney nodded. Your Honor, we have one final witness. Lisa raised an eyebrow. Proceed. The doors opened once more. And this time, the entire room stiffened. Because the person stepping inside wasn't another victim. It was the police chief. Tate's stomach dropped. Chief Sullivan strode into the courtroom, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable. Lisa straightened. Chief Sullivan. Sullivan nodded. Judge Montgomery. Lisa gestured to the stand. Please take a seat. Sullivan sat, folding his hands. The attorney stepped forward. Chief Sullivan, you've reviewed the complaints against Officers Tate and Reynolds, correct? Sullivan nodded once. I have. Lisa studied him. And what do you intend to do about it? The chief exhaled slowly. Then, in a voice firm and unwavering, he said, the department will be conducting a full review of all past arrests and stop-and-frisk incidents involving these officers. We will also be implementing mandatory bias training and reviewing department-wide policies regarding stops and detainments. The courtroom erupted. Lisa tapped her gavel. Order. Slowly, the room quieted. Lisa turned to the chief. And what will happen to the officers in question? Sullivan glanced at Tate and Reynolds. Then, he delivered the words that changed everything. Officer Reynolds has submitted his resignation, effective immediately. A gasp rippled through the room. Lisa turned to Reynolds. He was staring at his hands, his face unreadable. Lisa looked back at the chief. And Officer Tate. Sullivan's expression darkened. That remains to be seen. Tate's heart pounded. Lisa nodded slowly. Then we'll see where justice takes us. And with one final boom of the gavel, the courtroom was dismissed. But Lisa knew one thing for certain. This fight wasn't over yet. The sound of Lisa's gavel still echoed in Tate's ears long after the courtroom had emptied. Reynolds was gone. Resigned. And now, all eyes were on him. Tate sat in his squad car later that evening, gripping the steering wheel so hard his fingers ached. His uniform felt heavier than usual, like it was pressing down on his chest, suffocating him. He had spent years wearing this badge, years believing that he was doing the right thing. But now he wasn't so sure. The chief's words played over in his mind. That remains to be seen. Tate exhaled sharply, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. What did he even see anymore? Lisa Montgomery sat in her office, rubbing her temples. The day had been long, draining, but there was still work to do. A soft knock at her door made her look up. Come in. The door opened, and Claire stepped inside, a knowing look on her face. You look exhausted. Lisa sighed. Because I am. Claire sat in the chair across from her. Today was big. Lisa nodded. Yes, but it's not over yet. Claire studied her. You think the chief is really going to follow through? Lisa exhaled. I think he doesn't have a choice. Not with the eyes of the entire city watching him. Claire smirked. And who put them there? Lisa didn't respond. Because she knew the answer. Claire leaned forward. And what about Tate? Lisa's fingers drummed against her desk. That's the question, isn't it? Claire tilted her head. Do you think he deserves another chance? Lisa inhaled sharply. That was the hard part. She had spent her career making sure justice was fair, balanced. She had sent people to prison. She had also given second chances when they were deserved. But was he deserving? Lisa didn't answer right away. Because the truth was, she didn't know. Tate arrived at the precinct early the next morning. The air was thick with whispers. Some of his fellow officers barely looked at him. Others watched him with something that almost looked like curiosity, like they were waiting to see what he'd do next. He walked straight to Chief Sullivan's office and knocked. Come in. Tate stepped inside. The chief was standing by his desk, arms crossed. His expression was unreadable. Tate took a deep breath. Sir. Sullivan stared at him for a long moment before speaking. You're here early. Tate nodded. I need to know where I stand. The chief sighed, rubbing his chin. Where you stand? Yes, sir. Tate squared his shoulders. I made mistakes. I see that now. But I want to make it right. Sullivan exhaled. You want to make it right? Tate nodded. The chief studied him. Then, he walked over to his desk, pulled out a folder, and tossed it onto the surface. That's your record. Tate glanced at it, his stomach tightening. Sullivan's voice was firm. You've had dozens of complaints filed against you, Tate. Some dismissed, some investigated, some conveniently ignored. Tate swallowed hard. The chief continued. And now, the public wants justice. The department wants to clean house. He crossed his arms. So tell me, why should I keep you? Tate's heart pounded. Because he knew he didn't have an answer. Lisa wasn't surprised when her phone rang. She wasn't even surprised when she saw who was calling. She answered. Chief. Sullivan's voice was firm. Judge Montgomery. I need your insight. Lisa leaned back in her chair. Regarding Officer Tate. Lisa's lips pressed together. I assume he went to see you. He did, the chief confirmed. Says he wants to make things right. Lisa sighed. And do you believe him? Sullivan was silent for a moment. I don't know. That's why I'm calling you. Lisa hesitated. This was his decision, not hers. But the truth was, her opinion carried weight now. She thought about Tate, about his silence in the courtroom, about the moment he finally admitted, on record, that he was wrong. It wasn't enough. Not yet. But maybe there was a way to turn this into something more. Lisa exhaled. If he wants to make things right, then he needs to prove it. The chief was quiet. Then, he said, I agree. Lisa leaned forward. So here's what I propose. And as she spoke, she saw the future unfold. Because justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about change. And this was how it would begin. Tate sat in the chief's office, his stomach tight, waiting. Finally, Sullivan looked up. You want to stay in this department? The chief asked. Tate nodded. Yes, sir. Sullivan exhaled. Then you're going to earn it. Tate frowned. Sir. The chief leaned forward. You're being reassigned. Tate blinked. To where? Sullivan's eyes burned with something sharp. To community service. Racial bias training. Civil rights education. And you're going to sit down with every single person who filed a complaint against you and hear them out. Tate's throat went dry. You wanted to make things right, Sullivan interrupted. Then prove it. Tate swallowed hard. Because he had come in here expecting punishment. But instead, he was being given a choice. A second chance. And this time, he wasn't going to waste it. Lisa closed the case file on her desk, exhaling. This wasn't the ending. This was the beginning. Change wasn't immediate. It wasn't simple. But today, a step had been taken. And that was enough for now. Tate sat in the back of a cramped community center, his arms crossed, his jaw tight. The air smelled like old wood and cheap coffee, and the room was filled with people, most of whom were not happy to see him. He didn't blame them. Lisa Montgomery sat at the front of the room, flipping through a stack of papers. She wasn't in her judge's robe today, just a simple navy blouse and slacks, but she still carried the same presence, the kind that made it clear she was in charge. She glanced up at him, then back at the crowd. Before we begin, she said, let's make one thing clear. The murmuring in the room quieted. Lisa's gaze swept across them. This is not a courtroom. No one is here to argue. No one is here to be silenced. We are here to speak. And more importantly, she turned her eyes to Tate, her voice firm. We are here to listen. Tate shifted uncomfortably. Lisa turned to the first speaker. Marcus Ellison. Tate exhaled sharply. He should have known Marcus would be the first. Marcus sat up straight, his voice steady. I don't want to be here, he said bluntly. I don't want to look at you. I don't want to waste my time talking to a man who put me in handcuffs for standing outside my own home. The tension in the room tightened. Tate swallowed. Marcus leaned forward. But you know why I'm here? Because I need to know something. His jaw clenched. I need to know if you actually get it. Tate hesitated. Then, after a long moment, he exhaled. I think I do, he said quietly. Marcus arched an eyebrow. Do you? Tate nodded. His voice felt thick, unfamiliar. I didn't see it before. I didn't see what I was doing. Not really. But now, when I look back, his fingers curled into fists. I see the damage. Marcus studied him for a long moment. Then he scoffed. Yeah? And what are you going to do about it? The room was silent. Tate inhaled sharply. He had been asked that question before, by Lisa, by the chief, by himself. But now it mattered. I don't know yet, he admitted. But I know I can't just say I'm sorry and walk away. His throat tightened. I want to fix it. Lisa watched him carefully. The room remained tense. And then, slowly, Marcus nodded. Just once. He didn't forgive him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But it was a start. And for now, that was enough. Lisa stepped outside after the session, inhaling the crisp evening air. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the city. She felt lighter. Change was slow, frustrating. Sometimes it felt impossible. But today, she had seen something shift. She heard footsteps behind her. Tate. She didn't turn around. That was hard, wasn't it? Tate sighed. Yeah. Lisa glanced at him. Good. He huffed out a small laugh. You don't make things easy, do you? Lisa smirked. Did you think change was going to be easy? Tate shook his head. No. But I didn't think it would feel like this. Lisa studied him. And how does it feel? Tate exhaled. Like I'm finally seeing the world for the first time. Lisa nodded, satisfied. Because that meant he was finally getting it. And maybe, just maybe, There was hope after all. Tate sat in his car outside the precinct, gripping the steering wheel. For the first time in his career, he felt like a stranger in his own uniform. Yesterday's community session had shaken something loose in him. Hearing their stories, their anger, their pain, it was different than reading complaints on paper. It was raw. It was real. And now, he had to go back into the station, where officers would either look at him like a traitor or act like nothing had changed. Neither option sat well with him. He took a deep breath, then stepped out of the car. Inside, the usual morning buzz filled the station. Phones ringing, officers chatting over bad coffee, the low hum of a police scanner. But when Tate walked in, the energy shifted. Some officers kept their heads down. Some gave him wary glances. Others, they just stared. Tate. He turned toward the voice. Sergeant Davis, a grizzled, no-nonsense cop who had been on the force for decades. Tate nodded. Sarge. Davis folded his arms. Heard you've been spending some time at those, community meetings. Tate's stomach tightened. He forced himself to keep his voice level. Yeah. Davis tilted his head. You gonna tell me you suddenly think we're all the bad guys? Tate's jaw clenched. No, he exhaled. But I think I've been part of the problem. Davis scoffed, shaking his head. You've been watching too much of the news. Tate frowned. No, I've been listening to the people we're supposed to protect. Davis's expression darkened. You sure you're still on the right side, son? Tate stared at him. I don't think there's just one side anymore. A thick silence passed between them. Then, Davis muttered, be careful. And just like that, he walked away. Tate exhaled sharply. This wasn't going to be easy. Lisa Montgomery sat across from Chief Sullivan in his office, flipping through a file. The chief studied her. So, what do you think? Lisa closed the file and leaned back. I think you've got a department full of officers who are watching how you handle this. Sullivan nodded. I know. Lisa tilted her head. And I think if you let Tate stay on the force without real accountability, it sends the wrong message. Sullivan sighed, rubbing his temples. I can't just fire him. The union would have a field day. Lisa smirked. I never said fire him. The chief raised an eyebrow. Then what are you suggesting? Lisa folded her hands. Make him do the work. Sullivan frowned. What kind of work? Lisa leaned forward. You put him through every form of bias training, every community outreach program. Make him partner with officers who actually understand de-escalation and community trust. Take him off street patrol until he proves he can actually serve the people, not just police them. The chief exhaled. You think he'll do it? Lisa shrugged. That's up to him. Sullivan thought for a long moment. Then he nodded. All right, he said. Let's see if he means it. Tate's stomach twisted as he stood in front of Chief Sullivan's desk. The chief eyed him carefully. You want to stay in this department? Tate nodded. Yes, sir. Sullivan leaned forward. Then you're going to prove that you deserve to wear that badge. Tate swallowed hard. What do you need me to do? Sullivan handed him a folder. Your new assignment. Tate opened it. His stomach dropped. Community engagement. Civil rights workshops. Bias training. A 6-month probation with 0 patrol duties. This wasn't just a reassignment. This was a test. Sullivan's voice was sharp. You wanted to change? Here's your chance. Tate exhaled. I'll do it. The chief nodded. Good. Then, he said something that made Tate's chest tighten. And Judge Montgomery will be overseeing your progress. Tate blinked. What? Sullivan smirked. She's the reason you're getting this chance. And I trust her judgment. Tate let out a slow breath. Lisa Montgomery wasn't done with him yet. And something told him she never would be. Lisa was just leaving the courthouse when she saw Tate waiting outside. She sighed. I assume you got the news? Tate nodded. Yeah. Lisa studied him. And he exhaled. I'm going to do it. Lisa crossed her arms. Good. Tate hesitated. Why are you giving me this chance? Lisa held his gaze. Because I don't believe in punishing people just to make an example out of them. Tate frowned. So you trust me? Lisa arched an eyebrow. No. Tate blinked. Lisa's voice softened. But I believe in the possibility of change. She tilted her head. Do you? Tate thought about it. Then he nodded. Lisa gave him a small, satisfied smirk. Then prove it. Tate sat stiffly in a folding chair inside a local community center, his hands clasped together as a man at the front of the room spoke. It was the first session of his bias training, a requirement Chief Sullivan had placed on him. But it was more than just a box to check. Because Lisa Montgomery was here. She sat a few seats away, watching him, judging him. She wasn't here as a judge in a courtroom. She was here as a witness. And that made Tate uneasy. The speaker, an older black man named Charles Morgan, gestured to a whiteboard behind him, where the words unconscious bias were written in bold letters. Bias isn't always intentional, Charles said, scanning the room. But the impact? That's very real. Tate shifted in his seat. Charles turned to the group. How many of you have ever crossed the street because you saw a group of young black men walking toward you? Silence. A few people looked down. Tate clenched his jaw. Charles continued. How many of you have assumed someone was dangerous before they even opened their mouth? Tate exhaled sharply, because he had. More times than he could count. Lisa, sitting nearby, didn't say a word. But when Tate glanced at her, he knew. She was watching his reaction. She wanted to see if he would be honest with himself. And that was the hardest part. After the session, Tate stepped outside, breathing in the crisp evening air. Lisa was already there, arms crossed. So, Tate exhaled. So what? Lisa tilted her head. Did you learn anything? Tate hesitated. Then, he let out a dry chuckle. I learned that I've spent a long time thinking I was one of the good guys. Lisa studied him. And now, Tate swallowed. Now I'm not so sure. Lisa's lips pressed into a thin line. Then, after a moment, she said, Good. Tate frowned. Good. Lisa turned to face him fully. If you still thought you were one of the good guys after hearing all that, you wouldn't belong in this program. Tate exhaled. So what? You think there's hope for me now? Lisa smirked. I think you're starting to see reality. And with that, she walked away, leaving Tate alone with his thoughts. And for the first time, he didn't try to ignore them. Lisa sat in her office later that night, flipping through her notes. Tate had changed. A little, but not enough. She needed more than self-awareness. She needed action. A knock at her door made her look up. Claire peeked inside. You busy? Lisa sighed. Always. Claire stepped in, plopping into a chair. So, how's our favorite work-in-progress officer doing? Lisa smirked. Trying. Claire raised an eyebrow. Trying. Lisa leaned back. He's starting to see it. Claire exhaled. And you think he's really going to change? Lisa thought about it. Then, slowly, she nodded. He doesn't have a choice. Because she wasn't letting him off the hook. Not now. Not ever. Tate sat at his kitchen table that night, staring at his untouched dinner. He couldn't stop thinking about what Charles had said in the session. Unconscious bias. He had spent years making snap judgments. Years believing he was just doing his job. But what if his job had been hurting people? What if the very system he had dedicated his life to was broken? His phone buzzed. A message from Reynolds. You're really going through with this? Tate exhaled. Then, he typed back one word. Yes. And for the first time, he meant it. Because now, there was no going back. Tate stood in front of a group of high school students, his heart pounding in a way it never had before, not even in the most dangerous moments of his career. This was his test. Chief Sullivan's orders had been clear. He wasn't just going to sit through training and listen. He had to face the people his actions had impacted. And now, here he was, in a packed classroom, with Lisa Montgomery standing in the back, watching his every move. A young girl with braids crossed her arms. So why are you here? She asked bluntly. Because they made you? Tate exhaled. He could lie, make this easy on himself. But he owed them the truth. No, he said. I'm here because I should have been here a long time ago. The room went silent. Lisa raised an eyebrow. Now, they were listening. Tate cleared his throat. I've been a cop for a long time. And for most of my career, I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was keeping the streets safe. He swallowed hard. But I wasn't paying attention to who I was targeting. I wasn't seeing the way my decisions affected people. People like you. A boy in the front row scoffed. You mean people like us? Black people. Tate flinched. Because the kid was right. Tate nodded. Yeah. His voice was rough. Honest. And I was wrong. Lisa's expression remained unreadable. The girl with braids squinted at him. So what? You want us to just say, oh, cool. He realized he was racist. Let's all forgive him? Tate exhaled. No. Lisa's lips curled slightly. Good answer. Tate met the girl's gaze. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to trust me. He took a deep breath. But I do want you to know that I'm trying to be better. Silence. Then, the boy in the front row muttered, We'll see. Tate nodded. Yeah, we will. Lisa smirked. Maybe, just maybe, he was getting it. Later that evening, Tate found himself standing outside Lisa's office. For the first time, he wasn't nervous about talking to her. He knocked. "Come in," she called. He stepped inside. Lisa was at her desk, flipping through files, but when she saw him, she set them aside. Tate exhaled. "I think today was the first time I actually felt like I was doing something real." Lisa leaned back. "You were?" Tate hesitated. "Is that enough?" Lisa studied him for a long moment. Then, she shook her head. "No." Tate's stomach sank. But then, Lisa smirked. "But it's a start." Tate exhaled, shoulders loosening. That was the first time she had given him even a little credit. Lisa tapped her pen on the desk. "One last test, Officer Tate." Tate frowned. "What do you mean?" Lisa's smirk disappeared. "Tomorrow, we're going to revisit the place this all started." Tate's stomach twisted. He already knew what she meant. The street where he had arrested her. Lisa folded her hands. "Are you ready for that?" Tate met her gaze. For the first time, he wasn't just thinking about himself. He was thinking about her. About all of them. And when he answered, it wasn't for his career. It wasn't for redemption. It was for the truth. "Yes," he said. "I'm ready." Lisa nodded. And just like that, the final test began. Tate stood on the sidewalk where it had all started. The morning air was crisp, the city alive with movement. Cars hummed down the street. Pedestrians walked by, without a second glance. To anyone else, this was just another corner in another neighborhood. But to him, to Lisa Montgomery, this was the place where everything changed. Lisa stood a few feet away, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She had brought him here for a reason. Tate exhaled, glancing around. The memory of that day played in his mind like a scene from a movie. The way he had approached her, the way he had grabbed her arm without asking a single question, the way he had thrown her in the back of his squad car, like she was nothing more than a case file. Back then, he hadn't thought twice about it. Now, it made his stomach turn. Lisa watched him carefully. "What do you see, Officer Tate?" Tate swallowed hard. "I see," he hesitated. Then, softly, honestly, he said, "I see my mistake." Lisa tilted her head. "And?" Tate exhaled. "And I see the people I never saw before. The ones I ignored. The ones I hurt." A silence stretched between them. Lisa studied him. For a long time, she said nothing. Then, finally, she nodded. "You're starting to get it," she said. Tate let out a slow breath. "Does that mean you trust me?" Lisa arched an eyebrow. "Not yet." Tate huffed a small laugh. "Didn't think so." Lisa smirked. "But I trust the fact that you're trying." Tate looked around again, taking it all in. Then, he turned back to her. "What now?" Lisa inhaled. "Now? You keep doing the work." Tate nodded. "And you?" Lisa's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Oh, I'll be watching." Tate chuckled. "Yeah, I figured." Lisa turned to leave, but paused. She looked back at him, her voice softer now. "Officer Tate," she said. Tate straightened. "Yeah." Lisa met his gaze. "Don't make me regret this." Tate nodded. "I won't." And for the first time in a long time, he meant it. Lisa sat in her office that evening, watching the city lights flicker through her window. She had spent years fighting for justice, years demanding accountability. This case wasn't just about her. It was about all the people who never got their moment in a courtroom. But tonight, for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that change was possible. Not easy, not perfect, but possible. She leaned back, exhaling. Tomorrow, the fight would continue. But tonight, she had won. And that was enough.